Before we leave the Dark Ages, I want to reemphasize how unique and different those ages were before we get away from them. There has been no time in the history of the world that was like the Dark Ages, and we need to pray God that we never see their like again. In many ways, they were dreadful. For 1,000 years, there was basically no advancement in the sciences, in medicine, in farming, in many things that we have seen, engineering, things we've seen great advances in just the last century. For 700 or 800 years, there was nothing. There was nothing. Again, the best roads that they had to walk on were Roman roads that had been made 1,000 years before. And so it was a unique time. Many people have tried to understand why there was so little progress. And one of the reasons was that people saw this world in the Dark Ages more than any other time in history, especially today. They saw this world as just a preparation for the life to come, and that if they were saved, if they were Christians, that's all that mattered, and this life didn't matter. They were unworldly in many senses, much more than we are today. So the life expectancy, for example, in the Dark Ages was around 35 years. That meant that by the time you were grown and had your kids and they were grown, you were about to leave this world. 35 to 40 years was the life expectancy. There were diseases in the Dark Ages that we never hear of today, like rickets and scurvy, things that were a product of vitamin deficiencies. And they had health problems that we haven't seen for 1,000 years, so we don't need to see them again. So it was a unique time. It was a unique time. And the people of that day, one of the things that we need to remember to understand the Dark Ages was that under the feudal system that was the system of government in the Western world, especially Western Europe, you were born into a certain niche in life. If you were the son of a shoemaker, you were expected to become a shoemaker. If you were the son of a blacksmith, you were expected to be a blacksmith, and you could never change your status. It was literally against the law for a blacksmith to try to be something other than a blacksmith. The only exception to that, you could never become king. You could never be a part of the royalty unless you were born into it. And the only exception to that rule, believe it or not, was the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church was the only institution in Europe during the Dark Ages where you could be born a slave, a serf, be born in a stable, and end up pope. It wasn't easy. Obviously, not everybody got to be pope, but you could climb as high on the social ladder as you could reach with your ambition and ability in the Catholic Church. Nothing else afforded you any chance of going up in the hierarchy that you were born into. And so in ways that it was a terrible time to live. Infant mortality was 25, 30%. That means if you had 10 kids, which was not an unusual family in those days, you buried 3 or 4 of them before they grew past the age of 5. Presumably they loved their kids then like we love ours. And so this was tragic. This was tragic to lose 3 or 4 of your kids. And so it was a terrible time to live. And of course, they had famines and droughts and floods and other natural phenomena that led to starvation. And it was not unheard of for whole segments of Europe to starve. And it led, of course, to rampant crime. Theft was very common in the Dark Ages, and the common penalty for theft was either to cut your hand off or to execute you, to kill you. And so this was a little different. And we need to understand that when Europe experienced the Dark Ages, it was not a good time at all. But in the midst of all these droughts and famines and things that were going on, and the isolation of the Dark Ages, where it was not unusual for a person, as I've said, to be born and never go 5 miles away from their birthplace before they died and were buried. So it was very isolated, almost no trade, almost no traffic. The roads were terrible. If it rained, it was a mud hole. If it was dry, it was dusty. Traffic was not easy, was not convenient, and it was dangerous. There were robbers that frequented the highways, and it was during the Dark Ages, of course. I presume you know that there was a forest that reached almost from Poland to France. I have read that you could walk for 150 miles and never see the sun over your head. You were in the shade of the trees. And it was during this time, of course, that the wolves that played such a large part in mythology, grandma getting eaten by the wolf, for example, that was during this time era of history, and it still is a part of our mythology today. But it was during this time when packs of wolves did roam the forests, and they were probably hungry too. And so it was just a bad time. And nobody was educated. Nobody went to school. There was no advancement. There was no point in learning how to read and write if you're going to plow the field. Your need to read and write was limited if you were going to be a blacksmith or a shoemaker. Some of the aristocracy were educated. The boys, of course, there was nothing for the girls. Of course, and then again, the priesthood. The Roman Catholic priests were many times the only people that could read and write in the whole village, whole town. So it was a time when the church was at its zenith, and by the church I mean the Roman Catholic Church, and it was all powerful. It could depose kings. The popes could decide who was going to reign. It was not unusual for a king to be required to kiss the pope's feet as an act of subservience to the king, to the pope. And so it was a time that was a lot different than now. And this lasted for hundreds of years. Dozens of generations came and gone in this time of the Dark Ages. And a little light started to crack through, though, in the year of 768. I remember Rome fell in 476, excuse me. So 300 or 400 years later, after Rome. Now, this wasn't the end of the Dark Ages, but it was the beginning of the end. A man became king in Aachen by the name of Charles, and he was a great ruler. He went on 78 campaigns. He was big, strong, tough man. He was a great administrator. He divided Europe into certain segments, and he appointed courts over each segment to help rule the countryside, and he tried to protect the weak from the strong, which is a very difficult job. And he was a great king. And on Christmas Day of the year 800, Pope Leo the Great, it was supposedly a surprise to Charles, but he was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. The first time in 400 years, this was a restoration of the Roman Empire. He was declared to be the Augustus. So on Christmas Day of 800, Charles became the Holy Roman Emperor, and this was a very important move, not only for the political association of Europe, but also for the whole area and its climate, because something happened here that we may not recognize, but it happened. I'm reading from The Age of Faith by Will Durant. Let me read a paragraph here. The coronation had results for 1,000 years. It strengthened the papacy and the bishops by making civil authority derive from ecclesiastical conferment. In other words, the Pope made the king didn't make the Pope. And because the Pope crowned the king, that put the church and the church hierarchical leadership above the secular leadership. It strengthened the papacy and the bishops by making civil authority derived from the ecclesiastical conferment. Gregory VIII, the Seventh, and Innocent III would build a mightier church on the events of 800 in Rome, the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire. It strengthened Charlemagne against baronial and other disaffection by making him a very vicar of God, because he was crowned by the head of the church, it put the stamp of divine approval on him. It vastly advanced the theory of the divine right of kings. It contributed to the schism of Greek from Latin Christianity. The Greek church did not relish subordination to a Roman church allied with an empire rival to Byzantium. The fact that Charlemagne, as the Pope desired, continued to make Aachen, not Rome, his capital, underlined the passage of political power from the Mediterranean to northern Europe. From the Latin peoples to the Teutons, above all, the coronation established the Holy Roman Empire in fact, though not in the theory. Charlemagne and his advisors conceived of his new authority as a revival of the old imperial power. Only with Otto I was the distinctively new character of the regime recognized, and it became holy only when Frederick Barbarossa introduced the word sanctum into the title in 1155. All in all, despite its threat to the liberty of the mind and the citizen, the Holy Roman Empire was a noble conception, a dream of security and peace, order and civilization restored in a world heroically won from the barbarism, violence, and ignorance of the Dark Ages. So, this great man became Holy Roman Emperor. I'm not emphasizing this because part of his rule, he exercised his rule by enforcing things like education for people, and he greatly emphasized the need for people to go to school and learn languages and learn the sciences and all the things that are important. And he kind of broke through the crust of the Dark Ages. He didn't finish the job. This didn't go far, but it went somewhere. It did something. And so he's credited with being the first light at the end of the tunnel for the end of the Dark Ages, which needed to end. Let me read a little more about him as he dies. This is what was said of him. Perhaps because he foresaw, speaking of Charles, because he foresaw, like Diocletian, that his overreaching empire needed quick defenses at many points at once, he divided it in 806, which a few years before he died, among his three sons, Pepin, Louis, and Charles. But Pepin died in 810, Charles in 811, and only Louis remained, so absorbed in piety as to seem unfit to govern a rough and treacherous world. Nevertheless, in 813, at a solemn ceremony, Louis was elevated from the rank of king to that of emperor, and the old monarch uttered his famous words, "Blessed be thou, O Lord God, who hast granted me the grace to see with my own eyes my son seated on my throne." 4 months later, wintering in Aachen, he was seized with a high fever and developed pleurisy. He tried to cure himself by taking only liquids, but after an illness of 7 days, he died in the 47th year of his reign and the 72nd year of his life, 1814. He was buried under the dome of the cathedral at Aachen, dressed in his imperial robes. Soon all the world called him Carolus Magnus, Karl de Grasse, Charlemagne, Charles the Great. In 1165, when time had washed away all memory of his mistresses, the church which he had served so well enrolled him among the blessed. They made him a saint. So, he was quite a man. And he started the process that ended the Dark Ages. You know, all forms of government have a self-perpetuation to them. And so it's hard to change. It took longer for Rome to fall than most empires exist. And it took longer for the church, the Roman Catholic Church, to fall than most churches will endure. And this is one of those steps along the line of ending the Dark Ages. And it's difficult to end a social pattern that's been established for hundreds of years. So he appointed scholars. He started schools. It was during Charlemagne's time of tenure that a lot of the schools started, like the University of Paris in Paris, and other schools, Reims and other places started schools at this time. Now they were basically religious schools, and you had to be a priest to be a teacher at these schools. But the start of secularism had begun, and it wasn't too long until these schools were beating the drums for the superiority of Aristotle over Plato, and we'll get to that in a later time. So, these great events started taking place. In 1095, just a couple of hundred years later, well, before we get to that, I don't want to ignore the church. And by church, I'm talking about the Jesus name, one God, apostolic church, which is the only real true church. During these dark ages, we never hear anything about them. But that doesn't mean anything, because you don't hear much about anything in the dark ages. That's why they're the dark ages. But I believe that the church existed. I think the church has always existed. I think the church will always exist. I do not believe that the church failed. I don't believe the church ceased to exist. I think it fell below the surface. We don't read about it, but it was there in some little village in Greece. I think there was a one God apostolic church. Some town in Israel, probably the Holy Land, probably still had a church in it. In Italy, I know this, that about 100 years after Christ, 115, 20 years after Christ, there were Christians in Rome that were being persecuted, and they gathered their belongings, their wives, their children, and they went across the Italian continent to a more or less deserted area of Italy, and they went to a mountaintop, and there they built walls and established a town, and this was a Christian enclave in the middle of the pagan sea of ancient Rome. This is about 120, 125, when San Marino was established. That independent principality is still there. I've been there. You remember this only 150 years or so after Christ. This church was a oneness, tongue-talking, baptized in the name of Jesus church. It was established there. And we don't know how long it stayed. When I went there a few years ago, it looked Catholic to its toenails, and probably was. But somewhere in the back alleys of San Marino, there could very easily still be a one-God church that we just don't read about and don't know that's there, but it's still there, worshiping God in the old ways. The gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. The gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. So, even in the Dark Ages, even under Charlemagne, even during this time of chaos and trouble, there was a church. There was a church. Don't let anybody tell you that the church quit existing. There's always been a church. There will always be a church. 1095, in a field in France, a great pope by the name of Urban II called for all of Christendom to have a crusade. Catch that word? Crusade against the Muslims that had captured the tomb of Jesus, the place of Jesus' execution and entombment, and a great cry went forth in all of Europe, and a march started to march all the way to the Holy Land from primarily France, and this was the first crusade. The first crusade. I'm mentioning it because many people believe that this too was highly instrumental in ending the Dark Ages, because people that had never been outside their village all of a sudden were walking hundreds of miles away from their nation. They marched through Germany, through what we would call Eastern Europe, ended up on the Hellespont, crossed over into Turkey, marched down through Turkey. Of course, when they got to Turkey, they ran into the Greek Orthodox Church that helped them on their way. They got down to Jerusalem, and on Christmas Day, 1099, they captured the city of Jerusalem. And for 200 years, there was a Latin kingdom in Jerusalem, a Western European kingdom in Jerusalem. And what happened was that when these people came back from this pilgrimage, this crusade, they were smarter than when they left. They had been introduced to countries they didn't know exist, and they went into cities they didn't know exist. They met groups of people they didn't know. They ran into the Muslims. And when they ran into the Muslims, they found a very educated, very intelligent, very scientifically advanced people that lived very modern, good lives, at least compared to the Dark Ages. And when they came home, they said, how is it possible that people that are wrong in their theology could have such blessings seemingly from God? So it was another crack in the veneer of the Dark Ages. Trade started developing from the Crusades. from east to west, and when trade started with the Muslim world, it started in other places. Soon the Mediterranean was filled with ships, and there were a lot of ships going to England and back, for example, and in the North Sea. And things changed, and it is considered another step in the removal of the Dark Ages and the ignorance and the lack of advancement that they had known in Europe for so long. These Crusades had a positive effect on the European landscape. They didn't keep the burial place of Christ very long. The Muslims came in there and took it back, and there were several Crusades. I think there was 8 Crusades. Only a few of them actually went to the Holy Land. But one of them in 1453, a little before 1453, we went to Constantinople, which was a Greek Orthodox Christian city, and they destroyed the city. They razed the city. They took the gold, and they acted like barbarians. And their crusade, instead of going to Jerusalem, went to Constantinople and took the city. And so there was a lot of sidelines along the way. But it was a time of change in Europe. It was a time. And of course, this is important because it was a time of change in the churches too. Another great turning point in the history of Europe was in the 11th century at the University of Paris. And I'm saying this because they represent the goings-on of the age. A young man came to the University of Paris to be a professor. His name was Abelard. Probably a lot of you have never heard of him. I never had till I read the books on him. And he was a brilliant young man and a brilliant professor. And soon his classes were the most popular at the University of Paris. And if you want to read an interesting life story, read the story of Abelard. But one of the things that Abelard proposed, now you'll have to stay with me on this. This is not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy for me. Is he proposed the concept of universals. Now, a universal is the word they use to describe the fact that is there truth out there in the universe somewhere that's above and beyond man, or does truth only preside in the minds and hearts of people? Is there truth outside of humanity? Is there truth and light and understanding outside of just us? And I'm not talking about extraterrestrials. This is, if you think this is easy to answer, you haven't argued with somebody about it yet. For example, they love to use the example, if you destroyed everything that was red in the universe, would the concept of the color red still exist? Is there a redness out there in the ethereal world that we live in, whether there's anything red, my tie, for example, or not, it still is there. Now, that's a universal. Many people would say no. If there's nothing red to look at, then the red ceases to exist. Of course, you can't destroy all red. The rainbow's got red in it, but close to red. But what this really was a glorification of man. This was a glorification of humanism. This started with Abelard, and it hasn't ended yet. It was during this time, as I said before, that Aristotle came to preeminence in the battle of the great philosophers, Aristotle or Plato. And up until for 1,000 years, Plato had been the philosopher of choice. But Aristotle became more popular now because Aristotle is a very humanistic philosopher, whereas Plato is very spiritual, if I can use that word, philosopher. He believed the truth abided in the great ideas that God puts into our heads. Everything is God with Plato. Aristotle doesn't believe in that. He said that we know a tree because we've seen trees. We know beauty because we've seen things that we thought looked good and other people said looked good. So if something looks like that, then now we know beauty. We get it from experience. He talks about a posteriori knowledge as superior to a priori knowledge. Everybody catch that? And he said, our knowledge is based on what we see, what we know, what we're taught, what we understand. There's no such thing as some divine knowledge, some great ideas that God put in our head. I happen to disagree with Aristotle, but I am Platonic. But he became popular because he glorified humanism. He was one of the followers of Aristotle that said that man is the measure of all things. Man is the measure of all things. You'd never hear Plato said that, and you'd certainly never hear a Jew say it. But Aristotle glorified man, and he was a glorifier of rationality and order. It was Aristotle that started laying all the plants and animals in order and started all the things that go into zoology. Matter of fact, he's considered the father of almost all the sciences. And so this idea of universals promoted Aristotle. Most people this was the beginning of atheism. Because the natural sequential byproduct of universals is this, and this is what the Catholic Church fought on so hard. This is what made them willing to execute and burn at the stake the followers of universals, because does God exist? Or is God a concept that only exists in our mind? Is there really a God out there, or do we just think there's a God? Now, it'd be easy for us to answer that. Well, of course there's a God, of course, absolutely. But if you're not a believer, sometimes it's not that easy to say that. And so this is the beginning of secular humanism. It started with Abelard and universals in the 11th century. And of course, it would go on from there to the French Enlightenment, and to now we live in a world that basically doesn't believe in God. And this is the start of the old philosophical viewpoint. If I can't smell it, taste it, see it, hear it, or feel it, it doesn't exist. If a tree falls in the woods and there's nobody there to hear it, doesn't make any sound, well, a humanist would say no, and a realist would say yes. Because I'm not there to hear it doesn't mean it didn't make any sound. But they say everything has to go through our mind. Now, this is a forerunner of the empirical Europeans that would come along later, Immanuel Kant and Hume and Locke and Holmes and all those people that gave the church so much trouble in the next 400 years. But it all started with Abelard and universals here. And this was another crack in the facade of medieval thought. Men started thinking. They started saying, now, wait a minute. How's this possible? What's going on? It was during this time, of course, that many of the great universities were founded, again, as I said, but it's also a time when a lot of your great churches and cathedrals started being built. Some were older. The cathedral at Rouen in France and Reims started in the 700s, but they weren't completed till the 1200s. It took 500 years to build those churches, 500 years to build the church. But they built out a real thick block, and it's still there. They're still there. So it was a time when people started looking outside of themselves and outside of their little village and outside of their way of life, and trade started, and interstate commerce started, and they started trading with the Muslim world. The Europeans found that the Muslims had something that tasted real good. They called it sukar. We call it sugar. That was good. The Muslims gave us some fodder for our cattle. We call it alfalfa. That came from the Muslim world. There started trade, and the spices of the East, like pepper, was literally worth its weight in gold. The reason was pepper would hide the flavor of spoiled meat. You could still eat it after it's spoiled. So spices became one of the hot commodities with the Muslim world, and trade started. It wasn't too long after this till sailing ships tried to bypass the Muslims and sail around Africa and go to the Spice Islands without the Muslim help. And so it was just a start of a regeneration. All of this was important because the church was involved. And as the world prospered, the church, and I'm not talking about just the Roman Catholic Church, but all the churches. Of course, the Roman Catholic was the only legitimate, official one in the eyes of the governments. But we have to believe that if times prospered, then so did the Oneness Apostolic churches prosper. And for example, I have a good friend of mine named Larry Booker that told me that in the 1200s, a bishop wrote a letter to the Pope, that we still have the letter to the Pope, saying that there are people in his diocese that speak with strange tongues and dance ecstatically in church. And you know who that sounds like, don't you? And so behind the scenes in all these little places that we have never heard of, there were churches that still existed, that still believed in the oneness of the Godhead, that still baptized in the name of Jesus. The church has never gone away. Because it didn't make headlines doesn't mean it wasn't there. So, anyway, the world started to prosper and become powerful and trade and then, of course, let me close with this today. In 1347, 48, and 49, 1347, 1348, 1349, a ship landed in Genoa from the Black Sea, and on board they had trade goods, but they also had some rats, and on the rats were some fleas that had the bubonic plague in it, and all the ship's crew was about dead. They wouldn't allow them to come on the land, but they thought it would be safe to take the cargo to land, and so they sent boats out and unloaded the ship. Well, with the cargo came the rats, and so the bubonic plague, the Black Death, started in Genoa in 1347, and it soon spread throughout Italy, and then went over the Alps and went into Europe, and then went over the English Channel into England, and for the next 3 years, the world saw the Black Death. The European world saw the Black Death. If you think COVID-19 was bad, it was nothing. 500,000 or 600,000 Americans out of a population of 320 million. That's bad. I'm not sneering at anybody. I've lost 2 or 3 good friends. I've lost a couple of saints, but in the overall scheme of things, numerically, it was insignificant. In Europe, 1/2 died. 1/2 of the population of Europe died. And there were certain occupations that were absolutely destroyed. Doctors, nurses, hospital people, and then, of course, the Catholic priests. It's been estimated that 95% of the Catholic priests died in the Black Death. The good ones especially. They stayed to help with their parishioners, and they caught the disease and they died. The priests and the nuns died by the thousands. And, of course, when this Black Death had run its course, 1350, it had gone, but it left a Europe behind that was destroyed. It was decimated. There wasn't enough people to work the fields. There wasn't enough people to work in the factories. All the trade that had just started had died out. All the interstate commerce went away because there was nothing to trade. They didn't have enough people to make things, having trouble just surviving. And it took 100 years for Europe to get back to its 1346 population, 100 years for them to get back to where they were before the Black Death. So this was devastating. And one of those institutions that were devastated was the Roman Catholic Church. There were still people that wanted to go to church, but there was no priests to offer sacraments and to offer sacrifices and do all the works of the priesthood in those days. And so the Catholic Church, I want you to hear this very carefully. The Catholic Church started appointing men to fill those priestly roles, and many times they would have to appoint men that were not qualified, either educationally or religiously. They would appoint people that were friends and somebody they thought would do the job. Well, they appointed a lot of men that were very secular. They weren't devoted to the church like the old priest had hopefully been. And what you had then was a very carnal priesthood that evolved out of this. Of course, in time, they became bishops. In time, these carnal men became cardinals. In time, they became popes. And so the Catholic Church went into a time of carnality. The Catholic Church had not known it before the Black Death, but they knew it afterwards. 150, 200 years after the Black Death, the most hated people in Europe were your priests and your monks. They were seen as seducers and thieves and liars, and many times it was true. Men that did not love God and love his truth had been appointed to high ecclesiastical office, and it was just natural that they were not going to be godly. And so the church went into a tailspin that led directly to 1517 and a guy by the name of Martin Luther. One of the main reasons why the church fell was not its doctrine. It was its libertine lifestyle of the priesthood. And so that led to the Protestant Reformation, and we're getting on down the road. So next week we'll talk about the Protestant Reformation.